From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning, and in a few moments, good afternoon. I'm Tom Sherwood from NBC4 here in Washington, and the Kojo Nnamdi Show on WAMU Radio. Kojo said for me to be sure to say hello to you. Before we get started, we have to remind you, your cell phone is not wanted as part of the program. We will confiscate it, and I'll read your address list if it rings. I also want to remind you that there are, if you haven't seen them, video cameras. By being in the tent, you're consenting to be on the video and whatever the Library of Congress does with it. So thank you for being here. You know, we're close to the new Martin Luther King Memorial that after an earthquake and a hurricane is going to be formally opened on October 16th. We're close to the site of the new National Museum of American History and Culture, which will open, if everything goes well, in 2015. And of course, we're also close to the iconic Lincoln Memorial. But as a nation, we're far from knowing and understanding our African American history and the president who changed its course. So it's good here today to have historian, professor, and author Eric Foner. His life works have tried to make Lincoln and his times accessible and understandable to those of us who live in the aftermath. Somebody for the New York Times reviewing his most recent book said, "Do we really need another book on Lincoln?" And looking at this one said, "Yes, we do." Professor Foner's latest book, The Fiery Trial of Abraham Lincoln and American Slavery, won the Pulitzer Prize among other distinguished literary awards. So let's hear from him and not me now. Please welcome Eric Foner.
Okay, thank you.
That water's right there, George.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here. It's a wonderful thing for a writer to see so many people coming because of their love of books, and thanks to the Library of Congress and everybody who organized this wonderful festival. I'm going to talk for a while, and then, like my predecessor, Professor Jasanoff, will leave maybe 10 minutes at the end for questions. That's probably not enough, but at least we can take a few. Everybody knows that Abraham Lincoln is sort of the most iconic figure in American history. There are thousands, nobody knows, 8,000, 10,000 books on Abraham Lincoln of one kind or another. There are 3 Hollywood movies that actually 4, either were just made or in the works about Lincoln. The Conspirator just came out about the assassination. Steven Spielberg is doing a biopic about Lincoln. Lincoln the Vampire Hunter is on the way. So you can't escape from Lincoln. And in fact, there's an old adage in business that there's no product on earth whose sales can't be increased by associating with Abraham Lincoln. And I'm glad to see that James Billington, the head of the Library of Congress, appreciates this, because as you know, Lincoln is on the front page of the program for this, for this festival. But actually, I think it's a legitimate use of Lincoln, because one of the things that's so remarkable about Lincoln is that he was completely self-educated by reading. That's how Lincoln learned. He had 1 year of formal schooling in his entire life. It makes you wonder if my job is really even necessary, teaching. Lincoln learned by reading. He was a voracious reader as a youth, as an adult. He read everything he could get his hands on. He was not a very deeply religious man, but he read the Bible, he knew the Bible, he debated it with ministers. He knew the great works of great orators. He knew economics, politics, through reading. So there's a lesson in that for us at this festival. So with all these books about Lincoln out there, why, I suppose it's worth asking, did I feel that I wanted to write another book about Lincoln? I think the reason is that I have a way of, I tend to write books when I get slightly, well, maybe not annoyed, but unhappy with the current state of literature. And over the past decade, as books poured out about Lincoln, particularly in 2009 when we had the bicentennial of Lincoln's birth, many of those are wonderful books, and I'm not here as a critic of other members of what one reviewer called the Lincoln Industrial Complex. But I think there's been a tendency lately for too many writers for those works to become too introverted, you know, self-referential. In other words, to understand Lincoln, all you have to do is study Lincoln. You want to know why Lincoln did something as president, you go back and look at his law career. You want to know why he held certain views about slavery, you study his early readings in the law. In other words, the wider world is a way of slipping out of view in too much of the literature on Lincoln, I feel. And I wanted to put Lincoln back really fully into the historical context. Now, my book is not a biography of Lincoln. There are many of them, of course. It isolates this one question, but of course it is the question about slavery and Lincoln's relationship to slavery, Lincoln's changing attitudes and policies regarding slavery across the whole point of, you know, the whole course of his career. I want to situate Lincoln within the broad history of what the great abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner called the Anti-Slavery Enterprise. I like that term because an enterprise is not exactly an organization. It's not really tight-knit. It's a kind of conglomeration of people working, sometimes disagreeing with each other, but working for some kind of general similar end. The anti-slavery enterprise included radical abolitionists at one end who demanded the immediate freeing of the slaves and integrating them or bringing them in as full equal citizens of American society. It included others who wanted a much more gradual approach, maybe taking many decades, and including monetary compensation to the slave owners for the loss of property and slaves. It even included people who thought that the solution to the slavery question was to encourage black people to leave the country, the so-called colonizationists. That is, slaves should be freed but sent to Liberia in Africa or Central America or other places. Lincoln, during the course of his career, occupied different places on this spectrum. In fact, the theme of my book, if there's a fairly simple one, is simply Lincoln's change over time. This, I think, is the hallmark of his greatness. Too many people take one quote, one moment, one speech of Lincoln and say, this is the essential Lincoln. But I think, as I say, the hallmark of his greatness was precisely his capacity for growth. At the end of his life, he occupied very, very different positions on these questions of slavery and the related question of race and race relations in America than he had occupied earlier in his career. Lincoln had a very complex relationship with these sort of radical, more radical abolitionists. These were people who worked outside of politics really to convince public opinion of the evils of slavery, and also what were called the radical Republicans, who were like abolitionists but working within the political system. He was not an abolitionist. He never claimed to be an abolitionist, but he saw himself as in an enterprise that he shared with them. In one speech in the 1850s, Lincoln said, every schoolboy, this may not be true anymore, every schoolboy knows the name of Wilberforce and Sharp. These were the leaders of the British movement in the 1790s to abolish the slave trade from Africa, not slavery itself, but the selling of the capturing and selling of slaves from Africa to the New World. Every schoolboy knows the name of Wilberforce and Sharp, but who can name one man who opposed them? In other words, Lincoln saw history going in a certain direction toward eventual abolition of slavery. He saw himself as part of that, but he wasn't part of the most radical edge, so to speak, of that movement. Lincoln was a politician throughout his entire life. He first ran for office, I think, at the age of 22, and from then on until his death, he was either in office or running for office most of his life, except for a little period in the early 1850s where he really just devoted himself to his law career. I mention that because maybe I shouldn't say this in this city, but today politicians are held in somewhat low esteem in this country. If you read, if you look at Gallup polls, the ranking of politicians as, occupation is just slightly above, I don't know, Wall Street bankers, sort of down at the bottom there. But Lincoln was a politician. He was a very good politician. He was a member of the Whig Party for the first part of his career in Illinois. But in the first 15, 20 years of his career, he said very little about slavery. The issues of importance to him were economic development, railroad building, canal building, what we call infrastructure today. He thought the government should create the institutional structure for promoting economic growth. It wasn't until the 1850s that Lincoln really emerges with the new Republican Party created in that decade, the antecedent of the current one, as a major spokesman against slavery. And in the 1850s, in speeches of eloquence and power, Lincoln emerges as a critic of slavery, but within the political system. Sometimes his language is quite similar to that of abolitionists. He calls slavery a monstrous injustice. He refers to it as a cancer on the body of American politics. He absolutely insists that slavery must be prevented from expanding westward. The issue in the 1850s was not the abolition of slavery per se, but whether slavery should be allowed to expand westward into the territories, beyond the Mississippi River, etc. Lincoln condemned slavery on many grounds, as economic, moral, political, but ultimately Lincoln spoke about slavery, you might say, as a form of theft, the theft of labor. Every person, he insisted, had a right to enjoy the fruits of his or her labor. Slavery stole the labor of one person and then appropriated it for another. This is not really a racial argument in any way. Everybody, he insists, has a natural right to enjoy the fruits of their labor. That's how he understood the wonderful wording of the Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The pursuit of happiness to Lincoln meant the ability or the opportunity to rise in the social scale, to improve your condition in life, as Lincoln himself, of course, had done, coming from very humble origins in his youth. And he felt that that opportunity existed in the North. That was the salient difference between free society and slave society. Slave society blocked off the path of opportunity, the path of improvement. Obviously, for slaves, there was no hope of improvement in the condition of their lives. But even many white people in the South, he felt, were sort of kept in a degraded position because of slavery. Well, with this language in condemning slavery, why wasn't Lincoln an abolitionist? Why didn't he demand the immediate abolition of slavery? Because Lincoln had other commitments as well, which were equally important to him. Lincoln was a lawyer. Lincoln was a deep believer in the Constitution. Lincoln was a believer in a sort of a sense which we still hear a lot about today, of course, of American mission. He called the United States the last best hope of man. In other words, he held this view that the United States was a symbol of democracy to the world, that we exemplified the superiority of free institutions in a world still overrun by monarchy and aristocracies and tyrannies. The role of the United States, the mission of the United States, was to demonstrate that democratic institutions were superior. And that's, of course, what he says in the Gettysburg Address, right? That the point of the war is to preserve government of the people, by the people, for, in other words, democracy. That's what the war is about. So there's this pulls him in two different directions. On the one hand, slavery is a contradiction to that. He says slavery makes us into hypocrites. We talk about freedom, we talk about liberty, we talk about democracy, and yet 4 million people in this country by 1860 are denied those basic rights of self-government, of liberty. And it makes people around the world condemn us for not even believing in our own professed values. On the other hand, Lincoln says, we cannot let the American nation sunder. We cannot let it fall apart. Because if the nation splits on this issue of slavery, then this mission of democratic progress will be, will be destroyed for the world. Now, I should mention that Lincoln is a believer in this mission, but not in what was called manifest destiny at the time. The way the United States should promote democracy, he felt, was not by invading other countries and telling them, here is freedom, whether you want it or not. It was to perfect our own society, to demonstrate to people that our way was similar. For example, he opposed the Mexican War, in which the United States went to war with Mexico and eventually annexed about a third or more of Mexico's territory. Lincoln thought that was certainly not the way to spread democracy in the world. But on the other hand, he said the only way to preserve this nation is to abide by the compromises of the Constitution. William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist, burned the Constitution. He said it's a covenant with the devil because of its clauses relating to slavery. Lincoln said, no, even though I oppose slavery, we must respect the legal right of the South to own its slaves. It's protected in the Constitution. We must even return their fugitive slaves. Much as I hate it, he said, it fills me with terror, sadness to see fugitives tracked down and returned, but that's part of the Constitution. It's part of the compromises which made the creation of the United States possible. Lincoln in the 1850s, like many, many Americans, cannot really conceive of the United States as a biracial society. He's charged in the 1850s by his Democratic opponents with believing in quote-unquote Negro equality. This was sort of like the nuclear weapon of politics, like communism in the 1950s. If you could accuse someone of that, that would weaken their political position. Lincoln says, no, I am not actually in favor of Negro equality, but he sort of hedges it. On the one hand, yes, black people are entitled to the natural rights of the Declaration, life, liberty, and property. Everybody's entitled to that. On the other hand, he said, as to the right to vote, no, I'm opposed to that. He comes from Illinois, a state which is deeply racist, which has severely discriminatory laws against black people. He shares, in this period, I think, many of the racial prejudices of his day, and he doesn't really think of the United States as a biracial society. In fact, in this period, Lincoln's solution, so to speak, to the problem of slavery is, well, he takes it from the two political leaders he idolized the most, Thomas Jefferson and Henry Clay, and that is what we call colonization. Slaves should be freed, but encouraged to leave the country. They should enjoy their natural rights, but somewhere else. And for at least 10 years, Lincoln promotes this idea of colonization, not because he thinks there's anything wrong with black people, but because he says racism is so deeply embedded in American life that even if free, black people will never be able to achieve equal rights. It is simply impossible in this country. Now, this, of course, led to much criticism. Frederick Douglass, the great black abolitionist, said, no, this notion of colonization is based on the idea that black people are not genuinely American. What needs to be done is to condemn racism and slavery as well. But Lincoln separated those two issues. He said, I'm against slavery. On racism, he once said, he was agnostic. I neither condemn it nor adopt it. He didn't think that race was the same political issue as slavery. But during the Civil War, he will change on this and other issues. And much of my book is sort of trying to track out Lincoln's evolution during the Civil War. Of course, it's the evolution of the nation itself, not just one man, and of the entire northern population, really, by the end of the war. I'm not going to try here to give you all the steps from the beginning of the war to the emancipation of the slaves. In the early days of the Civil War, Lincoln actually comes back with this plan, if you want to call it that, he had before the Civil War. That is to say, gradual emancipation with compensation, monetary compensation to the owners, and the colonization of the freed slaves outside the country. Early in the war, some people say, oh, Lincoln's so slow. I don't think he's slow at all. In the fall of 1861, before there's been any significant military combat, Lincoln goes to the 4 border states. You know, the 4 slave states remained in the Union. They did not secede. Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. He brings in the congressman from Delaware. Delaware only has 1,800 slaves. He said, look, we've got to get this emancipation thing going. Delaware can take the lead. Here's the plan. Here it is. We'll pay you for your slaves. It can be done gradually. We'll make sure they leave. You don't want a lot of free Negroes around. Delaware says, no, I'm sorry, Lincoln, we don't want your plan. We want to keep our slaves. You don't understand, Lincoln, we are slave owners. It's not money we want. Slavery is the essence of our society. To give up our slaves will change the entire nature of Delaware society. Well, if Delaware, with 1,800 slaves, rejects this rather moderate plan, what's South Carolina going to say about it? What's Alabama going to say about it? And what's Kentucky and their... So that plan does not go anywhere. It falls apart on one end, but it also falls apart on the other end. Black people do not want to leave the country. Lincoln has a meeting in 1862 with a group of black leaders, and he says, I want to encourage you to leave, you know, to have your people accept this colonization idea. He says, your people are suffering the greatest wrong ever suffered by any people. That's pretty strong. Slavery is the greatest wrong ever suffered by any people. But he says there is a prejudice against you that will make it impossible for you to achieve equality. Whether it is right or wrong, I will not say. As I said, he's not willing to take a position on that. Well, they come back and they say, I'm sorry, Lincoln, we are staying here. We are Americans. We have as much right to be in this country as you do, and we're going to stay here and struggle for our rights. So Lincoln's plan is kind of falling apart at both ends, you might say. Meanwhile, all sorts of pressures are building up for a change in policy. I'll just mention a couple of them. One, they're not winning the Civil War. By the middle of 1862, the war is sort of a stalemate. Fighting the war as army against army is not working. More and more people are saying you've got to attack the infrastructure of Southern society. That is slavery. Second of all, slavery is beginning to fall apart on the periphery. Wherever the Union Army goes, slaves start running away to the Union lines. You heard Maya Jasanoff mention that the British in the American Revolution offered freedom to slaves who came over to their side. This is fairly typical in warfare, that you offer freedom to the slaves of the other side to weaken the other side. It happened in the Caribbean all the time. Lincoln didn't say that exactly, but on the other hand, he allowed the Army not to return these slaves. Finally, in 1862, Congress forbade the Army from sending slaves back who had managed to run away to Union lines. So the action of these slaves is putting the question of emancipation on the national agenda. And then there's the problem of waning enthusiasm for the war. You know, at the beginning of the war, people say, oh, this is a nice and romantic thing. It'll be one big battle. We'll all march off and cover ourselves with glory. By 1862, it's pretty clear it's a long war. It's a bloody war. It is not romantic in the slightest. And for the North particularly, you need all the manpower you can get. Now, at the beginning of the war, they did not allow black people into the Army. Blacks volunteered, free Negroes, no. And then there were all those slaves, and more people are saying, we need to enlist black people into the Army. We need this manpower. So all of these things, and many others, are propelling Lincoln toward a different policy. And in September 1862, he issues the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And on January 1st, of course, 1863, the final Emancipation Proclamation. One of the most important moments, turning points, of course, in all of American history, and also very misunderstood. If people still think, probably they don't, that Lincoln just freed all the slaves with a stroke of his pen, no, that's not exactly what happened. The proclamation exempted the border states, the 4 states that were in the Union, didn't apply to them, Kentucky, etc. He also exempted certain parts of the Confederacy which were under Union occupation, because the only legal justification for the Emancipation Proclamation was that it was a war measure. He issues it under his power under the Constitution as Commander-in-Chief of the armed forces. It's military necessity, he says, that enables him to take this action against slavery. So the proclamation, if you read it, is a rather dull, legalistic document. It's a military order. Only at the very end does he say, this is issued under military necessity and believed to be an act of justice. Act of justice. But an act of justice is not legally, you can't just say, I'm doing this as an act of justice. There has to be a constitutional basis. But nonetheless, despite that, the proclamation is a critical turning point for the war and for Lincoln himself. What's interesting is how it completely differs from his previous outlook on slavery. It is immediate, not gradual. No longer are they talking about a long term. This is immediate. The people it applies to, over 3 million slaves, are free at the moment, henceforth. And it's the role of the Army to protect their freedom. Secondly, there is no mention of compensation. Henceforth, the Southerners will not get money for their slaves. Slaves are legally recognized as property, but that property right is just liquidated with no monetary payment. And finally, Lincoln drops this idea of colonization. No longer will he be talking about blacks leaving the country. In fact, a different vision emerges because the proclamation for the first time authorizes the enlistment of black men in the Union Army. Putting them in the Army is a very different vision than telling them they got to leave the country, right? And by the end of the war, 200,000 black men have served in the Union Army and Navy. And I think in those last 2 years of the war, after the proclamation, Lincoln's ideas really begin to change in a remarkable way on these fundamental. Once he issues the proclamation, he won't go back, and he begins to think through some of the consequences. One of the consequences is to think of America as a biracial society. Once you drop the idea of colonization, you've got to think about what are the rights these people are going to enjoy within American society at the end of the war. And I think the service of black soldiers is very important. Lincoln comes to feel that by fighting and dying for the Union, they have staked a claim to citizenship in the post-war world. Now, just briefly, I want to mention, sort of where Lincoln ends up at the very end of his life. Just to talk for a minute about two of his very last pronouncements on this, to show you how much change. One was what we call his last speech, which he gave in April, just a few days before his assassination, at the White House, in which he talks about the process of Reconstruction, but for the first time he publicly says, I think some black people ought to have the right to vote in the post-war South. Who? Well, he says the very intelligent, that is free blacks, particularly in New Orleans, who were there, were educated, propertied, but he adds also those who serve our cause as soldiers. The soldiers should have the right to vote. Now, of course, that's not everybody, but this is at a moment when only 5 northern states allow black men to vote. Illinois doesn't allow black men to vote. New York, where I'm from, doesn't allow black men to vote. So Lincoln is ahead of the curve, actually, in terms of public sentiment by advocating partial suffrage for black men in the post-war South. And then there's one of the most remarkable speeches in American history. Many of you may be familiar with it, his second inaugural address, March 4th, 1865. You go to the Lincoln Memorial, it's on the wall there. Let me just read you a couple of sentences of setting the scene for that inaugural address. On March 4th, 1865, Lincoln took the oath of office for the second time. The setting itself reflected how much had changed in the past 4 years. When Lincoln delivered his first inaugural address, the new Capitol dome, which replaced the original wooden one, was only half complete. Now the Statue of Freedom, it's up there, you can see it. The Statue of Freedom crowned the finished edifice, symbolizing the reconstitution of the nation on the basis of universal liberty. For the first time in American history, companies of black soldiers marched in the inaugural parade. According to one estimate, half the audience that heard the address was black. It must have been very tempting for Lincoln to use his inaugural address to review the progress of the war and congratulate himself and the nation on impending victory. Instead, he delivered a speech of almost unbelievable brevity and humility. He began by stating there was no need for an extended address or an elaborate discussion of the progress of our arms. He refused to make any prediction as to when the war would end. 1 week after the inauguration, Senator Thomas Bayard of Delaware wrote that he had slowly and reluctantly come to understand the war's remote causes. He did not delineate them, but in the second inaugural, Lincoln did. Slavery, he stated forthrightly, was the reason for the war. But he didn't call it Southern slavery. He called it American slavery. The whole nation, he went on, was complicitous in the crime of slavery. That's why the subtitle of my book is Abraham Lincoln and American Slavery. He goes on to say that nobody knows what God's will is in this war. We want the war to end, Southerners want the war to end, but God may will that it will continue. God may have brought this war as a punishment to the nation for the evil of slavery. God may will, he says, that the war will continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil is sunk. There's that stolen labor again, you see? 250 years of unrequited toil. It may all have to be destroyed to fulfill the will of God. And then until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be repaid by another drawn by the sword. Every drop of blood drawn by the lash. This is Lincoln rarely talks about the physical brutality of slavery. He generally talks about it as an abstraction, a question of rights and democracy. But here he's reminding the audience that the terrible violence of the Civil War had been preceded by 250 years of the terrible violence of slavery. That's the moral equation that he's asking people to think about. In other words, he had previously talked about compensation to the owners. Now, implicitly, he's raising the question of compensation to the slaves. Maybe not monetary compensation, but moral compensation and political compensation. He's asking the country to think about what do we owe to the slaves for the 250 years of slavery in America? What are the requirements of justice in the face of that reality? What is necessary to enable these emancipated people, their children, their descendants, to enjoy the pursuit of happiness that he had always said they were entitled to, but that had been so long denied to them? Well, of course, within a month or so, Lincoln is killed. He does not live to try to address those profound and difficult questions. And in some way, these questions of the legacy of slavery and how to actually ensure equality in this country, those questions are still bedeviling our society 150 years later. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you. So we have a little time for questions, so let me take the gentleman at the mic there.
I recently heard the claim that Abraham Lincoln was the only U.S. president that was never a member of an institutional church. Why do you think Lincoln was, why did he never join a church, and do you know if he ever came close to making that commitment?
All right.
And how seriously do you see Lincoln using his obviously vast biblical knowledge and applying that to slavery?
Okay, Lincoln, I don't know if he was the only president who never joined the church, but it is certainly true that he never became, he attended services with his wife sometimes, but he never became a member of a church. Lincoln was really a child of the Enlightenment and of the era of the Revolution. If he had religious views, they were more of this kind of deist kind, like most of our founding fathers and Thomas Paine, who we read as a youth. That is, you know, God had sort of created the world and created the laws of nature, and then he left town, you know, and there was no point. Organizational religion was sort of beside the point. He didn't really have this personal notion of Jesus Christ as a savior the way so many Americans did. He understood the importance of evangelical religion. He declared days of thanksgiving. He met with ministers, and he knew the Bible up and down, absolutely. But he never had that personal religious faith that, now why? how can you explain why somebody has religious faith and another person doesn't? During the war, he mulled over this question, what is God's will? And as I said, in the second inaugural, it's almost like a sermon. He quotes the Bible a number of times in that 7 or 8 minute address. But Lincoln was a very private man. Problem for the historians. He didn't keep a diary. He didn't write a lot of letters. So his innermost thoughts, the only way we can gauge them is through his public statements and his actions, and he didn't have that deep religious, personal sense of commitment that so many Americans of his era and our own do. Now, the fact that he could get elected president at that time shows you that we live in a different political world now. I don't think we've had too many candidates later who never joined a church in their whole life. Anyway, thank you. Yes, over at this mic, do we have a question?
Yes, we do.
Yes.
My question is about George Washington's abuse of power and slavery.
Wait, can you speak a little closer to the mic?
My question is about George Washington and his abuse of his presidential power in regards to slavery.
George Washington.
George Washington used slaves. And he used slaves in Philadelphia.
Right.
Even disregarding what Abraham Lincoln was trying to pursue. I'm just wondering if you have any take on George Washington's abuse of power in slavery.
Okay, this is about George Washington. Yes, the first capital of the United States, of course, was not here, but in Philadelphia in the 1790s. Pennsylvania had abolished slavery, and you were not allowed to bring slaves into Pennsylvania except for a very brief length of time. Washington, as president, brought slaves. He was a slave owner, of course. He brought slaves. He kept them there. Sometimes he shuttled them back and forth to Virginia to avoid the law of Pennsylvania. One of his slaves escaped, and he had, tried to recover him. Washington, like so many of our founders in Virginia, all of the founders of Virginia were slave owners, and yet, so in that sense, he's using his power as president to get around the local law of Pennsylvania. It is also true, of course, that unlike Thomas Jefferson, in his will, Washington provides for the freedom of all his slaves. He's one of the very few of those founders who actually frees all the slaves he can in his will, and indeed, in the will, it's like he underlines it. He puts it in bold letters that his trustees are to execute this part of the will first. I don't care if I'm in debt. I don't care first you free the slaves, then you deal with all the other property things. So he was very adamant about that. So, this is the contradiction of the American Revolution. You heard one contradiction before, that the men and women who fought for liberty often were slave owners. And Lincoln is trying to deal with that contradiction a couple of generations later. Yes?
Oops, is this on? Yeah, Delaware, if I could. You put forward the proposition that Delaware rejected Lincoln's offer of money because they said it was fundamental to their society and their will. That's, blatantly absurd. It was 5–6% of the economy of the state.
Right.
So just kind of relating this to the evolution that happened in Delaware, where they did finally come to agree with Lincoln, and if I could, related to today, we have politicians making pledges. And I'm wondering if Delaware wasn't kind of caught in the same political trap. We have to reject Lincoln because we've made this pledge. And by saying that, is there hope for the Tea Party?
Yeah, I think you're perfectly right. Slavery was utterly peripheral in Delaware. I was referring to the slave owners, not the economy of Delaware. And it happens that wherever there is slavery, the slave owners dominate the politics. Delaware was dominated by slave owners politically, even though they were such a tiny part of the population. To the slave owners of Delaware, as to the rest of the slave owners in the South, slavery was essential to their way of life. Most of Delaware, as you say, had nothing to do with slavery. But slave owners would not consent to this plan of gradual and compensated emancipation. So that's really the point I was trying to make. And really the point is, if you can't get a state like Delaware to abolish slavery voluntarily, how are you going to ever get anyone else to do it voluntarily? That, I think, is the key problem. Yes?
I was interested in what you said about colonization for Lincoln's idea of blacks living in different countries. So if people were in favor, do you think we will look at blacks in a different way?
I didn't quite, the question is about this colonization idea, but what exactly is the question?
The question is, do you think, well, the reason I was interested in it because it was a great thing what you said. The question mostly is, do you think we will look at blacks in a different way now if it really happened back then, if people were in favor with it?
Would it really, yeah. You know, it's an interesting question because if you pick up most books about Lincoln, this was one of the things that actually surprised me. You might say, we know everything there is to know about Lincoln, and in a certain sense that's true. Nobody is ever going to find a big trunk full of documents somewhere in an attic, you know, oh, look at all this new stuff about Lincoln. No, everything of Lincoln is totally known. We know every letter he wrote. We know every speech he gave. It's all out there, the Library of Congress, it's online, no secrets. However, but I was surprised by some of the things that in my own research, I was surprised for how long Lincoln spoke about this idea of colonization. If you read most books about Lincoln, you will find that it is either not mentioned at all or only in a throwaway sentence to say, oh, well, Lincoln couldn't possibly have believed that this was possible. He just said it for political reasons or something like that. You know, I think you have to take Lincoln at his word, so to speak. What's more interesting to me is that Lincoln held this idea and then abandoned it and moved to some other position, which was that in the 1850s, he couldn't see black people as an intrinsic part of American society. He saw them as an alien people who had been unjustly and violently uprooted from their homeland and transported to the New World, and they should enjoy their liberty, but they weren't really part of American society. By the end of the war, he's seen them as citizens, as participants in Reconstruction, a complete change. And I think that is more interesting, that much of the Lincoln industry wants Lincoln to be perfect from the beginning. Born with a pen in his hand, ready to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. But no, that was not the way it was. To me, it's much more interesting how his ideas evolved, how he outgrew some of his early prejudices. It should not be surprising that a person born in Illinois, or not born in Illinois, but grew up in Illinois, held those prejudices. That was one of the most racist states in the Union at that time. So, as I say, did Lincoln really believe this was possible? All I can say is he talked about it for 10 years as a plausible plan, you know, and there were millions of people coming to the United States in the 1850s, Irish, others, so the transportation of people was not so crazy an idea as in a way it may seem to us in retrospect. I think we may have time for like maybe 2 more questions, okay? So let's take one over here.
As you suggested, slavery was the creator of wealth for many individuals and enterprises, the descendants of which exist today. Has anyone tried to investigate this condition, this situation, perhaps with a view of suggesting that these descendants owe society?
Well, of course, there has been, from time to time, the issue of reparations for slavery, which is sort of up the alley of what you're talking about. You know, people have talked about it. I think it would be utterly impossible to actually work out something like that. As Lincoln says, this is a national institution. It wasn't just the slave owners who benefited from slavery. The city I live in, New York City, its wealth came from slavery at that time. New York had a stranglehold on the cotton trade. New York ships shipped it. New York bankers financed it. New York crewmen manned the ships. You know, New York was totally tied into the slave South. A lot of the wealth went into the North as well. So to try to track out the wealth of slavery would be virtually impossible because it was so widely spread in American society. To me, the greater issue is not, I mean, as was said, not far from here is the new Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial. 50 years ago, King stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, as you all know, and delivered his great speech, I Have a Dream. He began that speech by saying, we're here to cash in the promissory note, the Emancipation Proclamation of 100 years before, you're right, and it hasn't been fulfilled. So he's putting on the question of the issue, how do you actually fulfill the promise of freedom, which to my mind is not a question of payment for slavery, but of social policy for American life, to deal with inequality which still exists in American society. That's really how I would think about it. One more question, and then we will call it a day. That's not on, I don't think, the mic. I can't hear it. Can you?
How do you do it?
Given the amount of time that Lincoln spent thinking about his impending death as he saw it, did you find anything that he ever gave any thought to what kind of president Johnson would be?
Well, that's a good question. Lincoln was a somewhat morose character in a way. He did think about impending death. He had a dream about his own death and visiting the White House. How did Andrew, excuse me, sir, please. Let me put it this way without mentioning any individual. Very often in our political system, people are put on a ticket as vice president to run not because of their qualifications to be president, but because they will appeal to some segment of the audience, right, of the electorate. Andrew Johnson was put on the ticket in 1864 not because anyone wanted him as president, but because he was a Southerner, a Unionist. They thought it would expand the electoral base of the Republican Party. Johnson turned out, a month later, after the inauguration, Lincoln is killed. Johnson turned out, I believe, to be the worst president in American history. I think it was a tragedy that Lincoln was killed. The problem of Reconstruction was a deep, deep problem, but Johnson was utterly incapable of dealing with it. Maybe Lincoln would have been able to deal with it better. But on that note of counterfactual history, let me stop and thank you all, and have a nice rest of the day.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.